Rain hammered against the towering glass walls of the Moretti penthouse, turning the Chicago skyline into a blurred kingdom of silver lights and shadows. Inside the 42nd floor dining hall, everything smelled expensive. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished black marble. A slow jazz melody drifted through hidden speakers while men worth billions whispered about ports, politicians, and syndicates over glasses of 20-year whiskey. But beneath the luxury, fear lived in every corner. The armed guards standing beside the walls did not blink. The servants moved like ghosts. Nobody spoke louder than necessary inside Dante Moretti's empire because power here was not loud. It was controlled, silent, dangerous. And tonight, Evelyn Carter was trying harder than usual to disappear. She kept her head lowered as she carried another silver tray toward the endless dining table. Her black maid uniform was perfectly pressed, her dark hair tied into a simple knot at the back of her neck. Nothing about her invited attention. That was intentional. Attention had never brought safety into Evelyn's life. Attention brought danger, questions, pain. Silence kept her safe. The women in the kitchen often whispered that Evelyn looked emotionally hollow, like someone permanently waiting for bad news. They laughed quietly about how she barely spoke during shifts. But none of them knew about the foster homes. The screaming men. The night spent hiding inside locked bathrooms while drunken footsteps searched outside the door. None of them knew she worked 16-hour shifts to keep her younger brother alive while hospital bills slowly drowned her. Trauma had taught Evelyn something important very early in life. Quiet women survived longer. At the center of the massive table sat Dante Moretti himself. The king of Chicago's underground empire barely moved, yet the entire room bent around his presence. At 34, Dante carried power with terrifying ease. His charcoal suit fit like armor over broad shoulders. Expensive watches glimmered beneath low lighting. His expression remained unreadable while men around him nervously discussed shipments and loyalty agreements. Everything about him radiated control. Stories about Dante Moretti traveled through Chicago like urban legends whispered after midnight. Politicians feared him. Rival syndicates respected him. Even federal agents struggled to touch his empire. People called him ruthless, emotionally cold, impossible to manipulate. Evelyn never looked directly at him. People like Dante Moretti belonged to the category of men she instinctively feared most, powerful men capable of destroying lives calmly. She carefully reached forward to replace a whiskey glass near his hand when another servant bumped her shoulder from behind. The silver fork slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly against Dante's plate. The entire dining hall went silent. Evelyn's heartbeat stumbled violently inside her chest. One mistake. That was all survival ever needed to collapse. Dante slowly lifted his eyes toward her. The room suddenly felt colder. "Well," he murmured softly, leaning back in his chair, "someone finally found a way to interrupt my dinner." Quiet laughter spread carefully around the table. Evelyn immediately lowered her gaze further. "I apologize, sir." Her voice barely existed above a whisper. One of the men seated near Dante smirked into his drink. "Does she ever speak louder than that?" Another chuckled. "Maybe the poor thing's terrified." Dante continued watching her carefully, his expression impossible to read. "Fear keeps people obedient," he said calmly. "Maybe that's why she survives here." More laughter followed. Evelyn stood completely still while humiliation burned quietly beneath her skin. But she did not defend herself. She did not react emotionally. She simply nodded once and reached for the fallen fork with controlled hands. Because reacting never protected her before. Across the table, 6-year-old Leo Moretti watched everything silently. Unlike the adults around him, Leo did not laugh. The little boy sat quietly beside his father wearing a tiny black suit, his dark curls slightly messy against his forehead. Since his mother's death nearly a year earlier, the child had become emotionally withdrawn. The staff whispered constantly about his violent nightmares and silent tantrums. Most nannies lasted less than a week before quitting. But tonight Leo's large dark eyes remained fixed entirely on Evelyn. Watching. Studying. Almost searching. Evelyn felt it the moment she stood upright again. The strange intensity of the boy's attention unsettled her slightly. Children usually avoided her silence. Leo seemed drawn toward it. Dante noticed too. For the first time that evening, the Mafia King's attention shifted away from business discussions and toward his son. Leo was still staring directly at the maid like he recognized something inside her nobody else could see. Something broken. Something hiding. The silence stretched strangely across the room. Then suddenly, Leo grabbed at his throat. A sharp choking sound escaped him. The crystal glass beside his plate shattered against the marble floor as panic exploded around the table. Guards moved instantly. Men stood violently from their chairs. Fear flooded the room in chaotic whispers. But Leo's face was already turning blue. And while everyone else froze in shock around the future heir of the Moretti Empire, Evelyn Carter was the only person brave enough to move. The moment Leo Moretti stopped breathing, the entire dining hall transformed from controlled luxury into silent panic. Crystal shattered across the marble floor while expensive chairs scraped backward violently. One of the syndicate men cursed under his breath. Another reached instinctively toward the weapon hidden beneath his suit jacket as if bullets could somehow solve a child choking at the dinner table. But fear made powerful people useless. Leo's tiny hands clawed desperately at his throat. His face darkened dangerously while broken breaths rattled from his chest. The future heir of the Moretti Empire looked terrifyingly small beneath the golden chandelier light. And nobody moved correctly. Not the armed guards. Not the wealthy politicians. Not even Dante Moretti. For the first time all evening, the king of Chicago's criminal empire looked completely frozen. His dark eyes locked onto his son while something dangerous cracked beneath his controlled expression. Fear. Real fear. The kind, powerful men tried desperately to bury beneath money and authority. Then Evelyn moved. The quiet maid dropped the serving tray from her hands and crossed the dining hall without hesitation. Her heartbeat thundered inside her chest, but her face remained emotionally controlled. Trauma had taught her something else long ago besides silence. Panic killed faster than fear. "Move," she said softly. Nobody expected the trembling maid to command an entire room full of dangerous men. Yet something in her voice sliced through the chaos immediately. Dante stepped aside instinctively. Evelyn reached Leo just as the little boy collapsed sideways in his chair. She dropped to her knees beside him, carefully pulling him upright against her chest. Around them, whispers exploded nervously through the dining hall. "She knows what she's doing. Who trained her? Why is she so calm?" But Evelyn barely heard them. Her entire focus narrowed onto Leo's terrified eyes. The child was panicking now, small body shaking violently while he struggled for oxygen. Evelyn remembered that feeling too well, the helpless terror of not feeling safe inside your own body. "It's okay," she whispered quietly near his ear. "Stay with me." Her voice carried no panic, no chaos, only control. And somehow Leo immediately stopped fighting her. Dante noticed that first. His son trusted nobody after his mother's death. Doctors, therapists, nannies, all failed. Leo screamed at strangers, broke things, hid inside locked rooms during storms. Yet now the terrified little boy clung instinctively to the maid everyone else ignored. As if her presence felt safe. Evelyn carefully positioned her hands and performed the maneuver with quick precision. The room held its breath. A heavy silence swallowed the penthouse while rain continued hammering against the glass walls outside. Then suddenly, Leo coughed violently. A piece of steak hit the marble floor beside Evelyn's knees. The child gasped sharply for air. The entire room exhaled at once. One of the women near the table covered her mouth emotionally. Several guards visibly relaxed. Someone muttered a quiet prayer beneath their breath. But Dante Moretti said nothing at all. He simply stared at Evelyn. Leo collapsed forward against her shoulder, breathing unevenly while small frightened fingers clutched tightly at her uniform sleeve. The little boy buried his face against her neck like he already knew she would protect him. And Evelyn instinctively wrapped an arm around him. Not carefully. Not professionally. Protectively. Dante's heartbeat slowed again, but something else inside him became dangerously alert. He had spent years surrounded by fake loyalty, fake kindness, fake affection bought through fear and money. Yet the woman kneeling beside his son expected nothing in return for saving him. No performance. No manipulation. Just instinct. Evelyn slowly looked upward toward Dante after realizing the entire room was watching her. Fear flickered briefly across her face again, like she suddenly remembered where she was. Inside the lion's den. She immediately lowered her eyes. "I apologize, sir." The apology stunned the room. One of the older men frowned in disbelief. "Apologize? You just saved the boy's life." But Evelyn already stood carefully, trying to pull herself away emotionally from the attention surrounding her. Survival instinct returned quickly. Dangerous men always became unpredictable after emotional moments. Especially kings like Dante Moretti. Yet Leo refused to let go. His tiny fingers tightened desperately around her wrist. "No," he whispered weakly. The room went still again. Dante's gaze shifted slowly toward his son. Leo never touched strangers voluntarily. The boy barely even allowed bodyguards near him during nightmares. But now he looked terrified of Evelyn leaving. Evelyn glanced down at him softly, her expression finally cracking for the briefest moment. Not fear this time. Sadness. Recognition. As if she understood exactly what loneliness looked like inside a child. Leo leaned closer against her quietly trembling hand. His breathing steadied while the storm continued raging outside the penthouse windows. Then, in the heavy silence surrounding Chicago's most dangerous Mafia king, the little boy whispered something so softly only Dante could fully hear. "She makes the nightmares stop." By morning, the Moretti penthouse no longer felt like the same empire Evelyn had entered the night before. The chandeliers still burned cold gold above the marble floors, the guards still stood like silent shadows near every doorway, and Dante Moretti's power still pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break. But something had changed. The most feared house in Chicago had gone quiet around one small boy who refused everyone except the maid his father had mocked. Leo Moretti would not eat breakfast unless Evelyn placed the plate in front of him. He would not let the private nurse check his breathing unless Evelyn stood close enough for him to touch her sleeve. When the newest elite nanny arrived in a cream Chanel suit with polished credentials and a practiced smile, Leo looked at her once, then silently walked past her and sat on the kitchen floor beside Evelyn's cleaning cart. The staff whispered in disbelief. The guards exchanged careful glances. Nobody understood why the prince of the Moretti Empire had chosen the lowest woman in the room as his shield. Evelyn understood more than she wanted to. Children recognized danger differently than adults. They did not always trust power, money, or perfect voices. Sometimes they trusted silence. Sometimes they trusted the person who knew how to stay calm while fear was breathing close. So when Leo curled beside the kitchen doorway that afternoon, clutching a worn storybook against his chest, Evelyn did not send him away. She sat on the small wooden stool near the pantry and read softly while rain tapped against the penthouse windows. Her voice was low, careful, emotionally controlled, but Leo listened like each word built a safe place around him. From his office, Dante watched through the security feed. He told himself it was caution. Leo had nearly died. The maid had become an unknown influence inside his home. A king protected his empire by studying every weakness before it turned into betrayal. But as Dante stared at the screen, the explanation felt less convincing. Evelyn was not performing. She did not smile for cameras. She did not lean into Leo's trust for attention. She read with her shoulders slightly tense, as if part of her still expected punishment for being needed. That disturbed him more than fear would have. By evening, Dante had her background file on his desk. Evelyn Carter, 24 years old. No criminal record. No family except a younger brother, Miles Carter, currently undergoing treatment at a private hospital she could barely afford. Years in foster care. Multiple placements. Several sealed reports. Too many addresses. Too many disappearances from school records. A childhood built out of hiding, escaping, and surviving adults who should have protected her but didn't. Dante read every line in silence. For years, loyalty had been simple to him. Men gave it because they feared him, owed him, or wanted something from his empire. But Evelyn's loyalty to her brother had cost her everything and bought her nothing. She carried debt, exhaustion, and trauma without asking anyone to save her. She was not weak. She was controlled because losing control had once been dangerous. A quiet knock came at the office door before Silas Romano stepped inside. Dante's underboss was older, sharp-eyed, and loyal enough to tell the truth even when truth became dangerous. His gaze moved from a file to the live security feed where Leo had fallen asleep near Evelyn's feet while she folded linen towels. Silas exhaled slowly. "Boss, attachment creates weakness." Dante did not look away from the screen. "Or loyalty." "Not with a woman like that," Silas said carefully. "She is emotionally scarred, poor, unprotected, and now close to your son. Every rival syndicate in the city would see her as an open door." Dante's jaw tightened. Somewhere inside him, something possessive and unfamiliar moved. Not desire alone. Not curiosity. Something darker. Protector instinct sharpened by fear. The idea of Evelyn being hunted because Leo trusted her made his chest feel strangely tight. On the screen, Leo stirred from sleep and reached blindly for Evelyn's hand. She froze at first, then slowly allowed his small fingers to wrap around hers. Her expression softened for one brief second before the mask returned. Dante saw it. The hidden warmth. The buried fear. The woman who had spent her life making herself invisible, now becoming the one person his son believed was safe. Then Silas's phone vibrated. He glanced down, and the color drained from his face. "One of our men just intercepted chatter from the Bell Syndicate," he said quietly. "They know about the Maid." Dante finally turned from the screen. Silas swallowed. "They know Leo chose her." The moment the Bell Syndicate learned the quiet Maid had become emotionally important to the Moretti heir, Evelyn Carter stopped being invisible. And invisible people survived longer in Chicago. Rain drowned the city again 3 nights later, turning the streets into rivers of black glass beneath neon reflections. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter as she stepped out of the hospital entrance after visiting her brother. The cold air wrapped around her immediately, carrying the distant sound of sirens and train brakes through the dark. Usually she walked carefully through the city without drawing attention. Head lowered. Shoulders small. Invisible. But tonight something felt wrong. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Trauma taught her to recognize danger quietly. It lived in strange silences. In footsteps that stayed too close. In shadows that moved when they should not. Evelyn glanced behind her near the empty train station platform. 2 black SUVs sat motionless across the street. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide faces. Fear curled sharply through her stomach. She immediately looked away and continued walking, trying to appear calm even as her breath shortened. The station was nearly empty except for a businessman reading his phone near the tracks and an exhausted woman sleeping against a concrete pillar. Rainwater dripped steadily from the ceiling while fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Then Evelyn heard footsteps behind her. Close. Measured. Controlled. She did not turn around this time. Heart pounding, Evelyn moved faster toward the arriving train, gripping her bag tightly against her chest. She could almost feel eyes following her now. Watching. Calculating. Hunting. One of the footsteps quickened. Miss Carter. Her entire body went cold. Evelyn spun instinctively and found 2 men approaching through the station shadows wearing expensive dark coats untouched by rain. They looked calm, polished, dangerous in the quiet way wealthy syndicate men often did. One smiled slightly, but the expression carried no warmth. "Mr. Bell would like a conversation," he said softly. Evelyn took a step backward immediately. "I don't know anyone named Bell. You know Leo Moretti." The air vanished from her lungs. The second man moved closer. "You've become important inside another king's empire. That creates complications." Fear surged violently now, but Evelyn forced herself to stay emotionally controlled. Panic made people easier to corner. She glanced toward the train doors beginning to open farther down the platform. Escape. The men noticed too. "You should come quietly," the first one whispered. "Wars begin over smaller things than this." Evelyn ran. Her shoes slammed against wet concrete while shocked passengers turned toward the sudden movement. She heard footsteps immediately behind her, faster now. Closer. The train doors began closing just ahead, but Evelyn already knew she would never reach them in time. Then another sound tore through the station. Black armored SUVs. The vehicles appeared outside the station entrance almost simultaneously, headlights cutting violently through the rain. Doors opened before the engines fully stopped. Men in tailored suits moved with terrifying precision across the platform while the atmosphere shifted instantly from quiet pursuit into silent war. Moretti men. The Bellandi soldiers froze. And then Dante Moretti himself stepped into the station. Everything around Evelyn seemed to stop moving for one impossible second. Dante looked nothing like the polished king from the penthouse dinner. Rain darkened his charcoal coat while dangerous focus sharpened every line of his face. His eyes locked onto Evelyn first, scanning quickly for injuries before shifting toward the men pursuing her. The station fell completely silent. Nobody wanted war between syndicates inside public view. One of the Bellandi men raised both hands carefully. This misunderstanding doesn't need escalation. Dante's expression never changed. You followed someone under my protection. The sentence landed like a death sentence whispered softly. Evelyn's breath trembled. Under my protection. No one had ever spoken about her like that before. The Bellandi men slowly retreated without another word. They disappeared into the rain moments later, leaving behind only heavy silence and Evelyn's uneven breathing. Dante crossed the distance toward her immediately. You're shaking, he murmured quietly. Only then did Evelyn realize how cold she felt. Rain soaked through her sleeves. Fear still wrapped tightly around her ribs. Dante removed his coat without hesitation and draped it carefully over her shoulders. The warmth stunned her almost as much as the gesture itself. You're safe, he said. Safe. The word hit somewhere dangerously emotional inside her. Before she could protest, Dante guided her toward the armored SUV waiting outside. His hand rested lightly against her back, protective, controlled, possessive enough to make her pulse stumble again. Evelyn should have feared him most. Instead, standing beside Chicago's most dangerous king was the first moment all night she stopped feeling hunted. Inside the SUV, Dante finally spoke again. You're not returning to your apartment. Evelyn looked toward him sharply. Why? His dark gaze held hers completely. Because anyone connected to my son becomes mine to protect. Her breath caught. Then Dante handed her a sealed hospital envelope she immediately recognized. Inside were her brother's cleared medical balances. Every debt. Paid in full. The Moretti penthouse no longer felt like a prison after that night at the train station. It still carried the weight of power, secrets, and whispered loyalty, but slowly, almost dangerously, it also began feeling warm. That terrified Evelyn more than fear itself. 4 years, survival had been simple. Keep moving. Stay emotionally controlled. Never depend on powerful men because powerful men always collected payment eventually. But now every morning inside Dante Moretti's empire began with quiet routines that felt unfamiliar in the most dangerous way possible. Safe. Leo waited outside her temporary suite every morning before breakfast, sitting against the hallway wall with sleepy eyes and tangled curls while clutching one of his books against his chest. He never knocked loudly. He simply waited because somewhere deep inside his traumatized little heart, he already feared she might disappear overnight like everyone else who promised to stay. And Evelyn always opened the door. One rainy evening, she found him asleep near the kitchen doorway again after refusing to return to his room. The soft golden lights above the marble counters reflected across the quiet penthouse while distant thunder rolled outside. Evelyn carefully lifted the blanket over the sleeping child and froze when another voice spoke from the shadows. He only sleeps deeply when you're close. Dante stepped into the dim kitchen light holding a glass of untouched whiskey. Without the crowd of politicians or syndicate men surrounding him, he looked strangely different tonight. Less like a king. More like a man exhausted from carrying an empire alone for too long. Evelyn straightened immediately. I didn't mean for him to fall asleep here. You think I'm angry? Dante asked quietly. She hesitated because fear still lived inside her whenever he stood too close. Not fear of physical harm. Something more emotional than that. Dante Moretti noticed things nobody else noticed. The silence. The hiding. The scars people carried beneath their skin. Men like him were dangerous precisely because they saw weakness clearly. Dante moved closer toward the kitchen island while rain whispered against the windows behind him. Leo used to sleep outside his mother's door after storms, he murmured. After she died, he stopped sleeping at all. Something painful shifted inside Evelyn's chest. For the first time, she looked at Dante not as the ruthless king controlling Chicago's underworld, but as a father standing alone inside a silent empire he no longer knew how to hold together. The realization unsettled her deeply. Dante poured hot water into a porcelain cup before sliding it toward her across the marble counter. Chamomile tea. Simple. Quiet. Gentle in a way she never expected from a man like him. You keep protecting people, Evelyn whispered carefully. My brother. Leo. Me. Why? Dante's gaze lifted slowly toward her. The silence between them stretched close enough to hear breathing. Then he answered with dangerous honesty. I protect what becomes mine. The words should have frightened her. Instead, her heartbeat stumbled painfully against her ribs. Mine. No man had ever spoken about her like she mattered enough to protect. Ownership should have sounded controlling. Possessive. Yet coming from Dante, the sentence carried something emotionally heavier. Loyalty. Responsibility. A shield wrapped around damaged things he refused to lose. Evelyn lowered her eyes quickly, trying to steady herself emotionally. This was how dangerous attachments began. Not through grand gestures. Through quiet safety. Through late-night tea in silent kitchens while storms whispered outside. Over the next week, the penthouse transformed slowly around them. Leo started laughing again during breakfast. Dante occasionally stayed home for dinner instead of disappearing into endless empire meetings. Sometimes Evelyn caught him watching them quietly from the hallway with an unreadable expression that carried both fear and peace at once. As if happiness itself felt unfamiliar to him. One night, Evelyn accidentally fell asleep beside Leo while reading stories inside the child's room. She woke hours later beneath a cashmere blanket she had not placed there herself. Across the room, Dante sat silently in an armchair near the windows, still wearing his dark suit from work. The city lights reflected behind him while his attention remained fixed on them. Watching. Guarding. Alone. That was the moment Evelyn finally saw the truth beneath the power and control surrounding him. Dante Moretti was isolated inside his own empire. And somehow, without realizing it, the emotionally scarred Maid hiding from life had started becoming the safe place inside the king's war-torn world. But peace inside syndicate empires never lasted long. The following evening, Evelyn stepped toward Dante's office carrying Leo's forgotten sketchbook when voices stopped her outside the half-open door. Bellandy wants her removed before the boy gets more attached. Evelyn froze instantly. Another voice answered quietly. Then it's decided. The maid dies first. The attack came on a cold Thursday night while Chicago drowned beneath another storm. Dante's convoy moved silently through downtown streets, black armored SUVs cutting through rain and fog like shadows carrying an empire inside them. Evelyn sat beside Leo in the rear vehicle, helping him finish a drawing from school while city lights flickered against the tinted windows. For the first time in years, something dangerous had started growing quietly inside her chest. Peace. Which was exactly why fear arrived seconds later. The first impact slammed against the convoy without warning. Tires screeched violently across wet pavement while one of the lead SUVs spun sideways near an intersection. Leo gasped in confusion as Evelyn instinctively grabbed him against her chest. Then came the sound. Gunfire. Sharp. Sudden. Echoing through the storm outside. The entire city seemed to freeze around them. One of Dante's guards shouted urgent commands through the radio while chaos exploded across the street. Headlights flashed wildly through rain. More black vehicles appeared from side alleys, surrounding the convoy in calculated silence. Bellandy Syndicate. Or. Leo's small body trembled instantly against Evelyn. The little boy buried his face into her shoulder while his breathing turned panicked and uneven. Evelyn's own heart pounded so violently she could barely hear anything else, but trauma did what it always did. It made her calm. She wrapped herself around Leo protectively, shielding him completely beneath her body as another violent crash shook the SUV. Glass splintered somewhere nearby. Men shouted outside. Fear filled the air so thick it almost felt alive. But Evelyn never let go of him. "You're safe," she whispered repeatedly near his ear despite not knowing if it was true. "I'm here. Just breathe." Across the convoy, Dante stepped out into the storm. The sight of Evelyn protecting his son through the shattered SUV window did something catastrophic to him emotionally. Every wall he spent years building around himself cracked instantly. This was no longer about syndicate territory, political power, or control over Chicago's underground empire. This was personal now. The Belandi family had aimed fear toward something Dante considered his. And Dante Moretti protected what belonged to him. Rain poured heavily over his dark coat while his men waited tensely for orders. Entire syndicates across Chicago feared Dante because he rarely lost emotional control. Kings who stayed calm ruled longer. But tonight he looked terrifyingly different. Cold. Focused. Protective. One of the Belandi negotiators finally stepped from the shadows beneath an umbrella, attempting one last political solution before full war erupted between empires. "This conflict ends if you surrender the girl," the man called carefully through the rain. "She is only a maid." Dante stared at him in complete silence. Then he answered softly enough that everyone nearby leaned closer to hear. "She stopped being only a maid the moment my son trusted her." The street went still. Even Evelyn heard it through the partially shattered SUV door. "Mine." The word existed unspoken beneath every syllable. The Belandi negotiator's face hardened slightly. "You would risk syndicate war over one woman?" Dante's gaze never moved from Evelyn holding Leo inside the vehicle. "She is under my protection," he said calmly. "And anyone who threatens my family becomes my enemy." Family. The sentence hit Evelyn harder than the gunfire outside ever could. For years she survived alone. Invisible. Disposable. Emotionally controlled because nobody had ever stayed long enough to protect her from anything. Yet now the most feared king in Chicago stood in the middle of a storm, openly placing her beside his empire, his loyalty, and his son. Not weakness. Not burden. Family. The Belandi men retreated shortly after. Nobody wanted open war with Dante Moretti after witnessing the expression in his eyes tonight. Fear spread quickly through syndicate circles. By morning, whispers flooded every underground casino, private club, and political office in Chicago. The quiet Maid had become untouchable. Inside the penthouse later that night, Leo finally fell asleep wrapped around Evelyn's arm while thunder rolled softly outside. Dante stood near the windows overlooking the city, his expression unreadable again, but something between them had permanently changed. No more pretending she was temporary. No more distance. Evelyn slowly approached him after making sure Leo slept peacefully. "You called me family." Dante turned toward her slowly. "Because you are." Her breath caught painfully. Dangerous men were not supposed to feel safe. But somehow standing close to Dante Moretti felt safer than every apartment, shelter, or foster home she had ever hidden inside. Then suddenly dizziness hit her. Evelyn steadied herself against the marble counter as nausea twisted sharply through her stomach. Dante moved toward her instantly, concern darkening his features. But Evelyn already knew. Her trembling hand moved slowly toward her abdomen while fear and shock collided violently inside her chest. And for the first time since entering Dante Moretti's empire, Evelyn Carter realized she was carrying his child. The news spread through Chicago's underground empire faster than fear itself. The quiet maid who once lowered her eyes in silence was now carrying Dante Moretti's child. And suddenly, nobody looked at Evelyn Carter the same way again. Inside the penthouse, security doubled overnight. Armed guards rotated through every hallway. Private elevators required biometric clearance. Even the kitchen staff whispered more carefully now because the woman once ignored by everyone had become emotionally tied to the future of the Moretti Empire. A queen protected by a king who no longer feared exposing his weakness. Evelyn struggled with that reality more than anyone. Some mornings she stood alone beside the penthouse windows watching rain slide across the Chicago skyline while her hand rested unconsciously against her stomach. Fear still lived inside her. Fear of losing this fragile piece. Fear that happiness inside dangerous empires always came with a price. But another feeling had started growing stronger than fear lately. Belonging. For the first time in her life, Evelyn no longer felt temporary inside a home. Leo noticed the pregnancy before anyone explained it to him. One evening during dinner, the little boy quietly pressed his ear against Evelyn's stomach before looking up with wide dark eyes. "There's a baby." The innocence in his voice shattered something emotional inside her. Dante watched the interaction silently from the opposite side of the table, but Evelyn caught the change in his expression instantly. The ruthless king who negotiated wars and controlled syndicates suddenly looked almost overwhelmed by the image of his son smiling again. Leo had not smiled like this since his mother died. Now he laughed during breakfast, slept through storms, drew pictures of Evelyn beside himself and Dante using bright crayons scattered across marble counters. Slowly, the broken pieces inside the penthouse started healing around her presence. And Dante noticed everything. He noticed Evelyn no longer flinched every time footsteps approached behind her. He noticed she walked through the penthouse with more confidence now, shoulders straighter, eyes calmer. She was still emotionally controlled, still careful, but no longer invisible. She was becoming powerful. Not through violence. Through presence. The underworld sensed it too. During private syndicate dinners, men who once dismissed her now stood respectfully when she entered the room beside Dante. Women married into powerful criminal families studied her quietly, curious how a traumatized maid somehow became the emotional center of Chicago's most feared empire. Because Dante Moretti looked at Evelyn differently now. Not like possession alone. Like necessity. One snowy afternoon, Dante brought Evelyn and Leo to a private medical suite hidden inside one of his luxury towers for the baby's first ultrasound. Evelyn expected guards, cold professionalism, another reminder of how dangerous this world remained. Instead, she found softness, warm lighting, quiet music. A female doctor personally selected by Dante. Leo sitting excitedly beside her while holding her hand through the appointment. And Dante standing unusually close the entire time, watching the monitor with an intensity that made her chest ache. Then the heartbeat echoed softly through the room. Everything stopped. Evelyn looked toward Dante instinctively. The powerful king of Chicago's criminal empire stared at the screen without speaking, but something vulnerable flickered behind his eyes. Fear. Love. Awe. The emotions seemed almost unfamiliar to him. Slowly, his hand moved over hers. Protective. Close. Mine. No words followed, but Evelyn understood anyway. That night, after Leo finally fell asleep, Dante found Evelyn standing inside the unfinished nursery overlooking the city. Soft golden lighting illuminated half-built furniture and scattered fabric samples while snow drifted silently outside. "You're quiet," Dante murmured behind her. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'm trying to understand how my life became this." Dante stepped closer until warmth surrounded her completely. "Do you regret it?" She turned toward him slowly. Months ago she would have feared standing this close to a man like him. Now his presence felt dangerously safe. "No," she whispered honestly. Dante touched her cheek gently, his thumb brushing against her skin with terrifying care. "Good," he murmured. "Because I would burn this entire city before letting anyone take you from me." Her breath caught sharply. The promise should have sounded monstrous. Instead, it sounded like home. But peace inside empires built on loyalty never survived betrayal for long. Later that same night, Evelyn walked quietly past Dante's office when she heard unfamiliar voices inside. The door remained slightly open. She recognized Silas immediately, but another voice answered him in a nervous whisper. "We found the leak." Silence followed. Then Silas spoke carefully. "The traitor has been feeding Evelyn's movements to the Bellandi syndicate from inside our own security team." The betrayal reached the Moretti estate just before dawn, when the sky above Chicago was still black and the mansion slept beneath layers of guarded silence. Evelyn woke to the sudden drop in power, the soft click of emergency locks sealing the hallway, and Leo's frightened whisper from the doorway. "Evelyn!" She sat up instantly, one hand moving to her stomach, the other reaching for him. The safe place Dante had built around them suddenly felt like a glass kingdom cracking in the dark. Red emergency lights washed across the walls. Somewhere below, alarms pulsed beneath the sound of rushed footsteps and sharp commands. Leo ran into her arms. Evelyn held him close, heart pounding, breath controlled even as fear rose inside her like cold water. Months ago, she would have hidden. She would have made herself small. But she was not that invisible maid anymore. She was not a victim waiting for powerful men to decide her fate. She was the shield now. A voice crackled through the hidden speaker in the ceiling. Dante's voice, low and controlled, but edged with something terrifying. "Evelyn, take Leo to the nursery panic room. Do not open the door for anyone but me." The hallway outside trembled with movement. The traitor had not simply leaked her location. He had opened the estate from within. The betrayal was not at the gates. It was already inside the Empire. Evelyn lifted Leo's face gently. "Listen to me. We are going to breathe slowly. You stay close to me, and you do not let go." Leo nodded, tears shining in his eyes. She moved through the dark hallway with him tucked against her side, every step careful, every sound sharpened by danger. The mansion that once intimidated her now felt like something she understood. Its shadows, its corners, its silent rooms. She knew where Dante kept safety hidden because he had built that safety around her. Near the nursery, a man stepped from the side corridor. Evelyn stopped. He wore a Moretti security badge. Someone she had passed dozens of times. Someone who had smiled respectfully when she entered rooms beside Dante. Now his face looked pale, nervous, exposed. "Mrs. Carter," he whispered, though she had never been given that title. "Come with me." The boss ordered evacuation. Leo's fingers tightened around hers. Evelyn saw the lie before he finished speaking. Not because she was trained like Dante's men. Because she knew fear. She knew the sound of fake calm. She knew what betrayal looked like when it tried to dress itself as protection. "No," she said quietly. The man's expression changed. Before he could move closer, the nursery door behind Evelyn opened from the inside. Silas appeared with 2 loyal guards, his face cold with controlled fury. The traitor froze, realizing too late that Evelyn had not been walking into a trap. She had become the bait Dante trusted to expose it. Within minutes, the estate shifted back under Moretti control. No unnecessary chaos. No public spectacle. Just quiet doors closing, loyal men reclaiming halls, and betrayal being removed from the heart of the Empire like poison from blood. When Dante finally reached the nursery, his composure broke only for 1 second. He crossed the room and pulled Evelyn and Leo into his arms so tightly she felt his breath shake against her hair. The King of Chicago, the man feared by syndicates and politicians, held them like he had almost lost his entire world. "You should have stayed hidden," he whispered. Evelyn looked up at him, calm despite the tears in her eyes. "I was hiding my whole life, Dante. I'm done." Something changed in his face. There, beneath power and control, Dante finally understood. Evelyn had not saved his son only once at dinner. She had saved him every day after. She had turned his empire from a cage into a home. She had taught his traumatized child how to sleep again and taught a dangerous man that protection meant more than ownership. By sunrise, the storm had passed. Golden light spilled across the nursery floor. Leo slept safely between them on the wide couch, one hand resting against Evelyn's stomach as if protecting the baby already. Dante sat beside her in silence, no whiskey, no empire papers, no armor left between them. Evelyn leaned into him without fear. For the first time, the monster looked peaceful. And outside the estate gates, far beyond the warmth of their safe place, unseen enemies still watched the Moretti family from the shadows. But this time, Evelyn Carter was no longer afraid of the darkness beside Dante Moretti.